All right, thank you. So yeah, I first want to just talk about use it or use it, and what we all think of when we hear the term use it or use it. And certainly I'm coming from the public side of what they think of when they hear that term. And what does come to your mind? But when you hear use it or use it, what comes to your mind? What comes to your mind is abandonment. And there's no doubt that the Colorado revised statutes require the division engineer to prepare an abandonment list every 10 years that is to be comprised of those water rights that have not been used in whole or in part over a period of 10 years. So there's no doubt there is an abandonment process we go through. Likewise, and that abandonment process applies to absolute water rights, but conditional water rights can also be abandoned. What I refer to as cancellation, but others think of as abandonment. So as Kevin said, I'm just going to touch briefly on the abandonment of absolute water rights and conditional water rights. So again, absolute water rights are subject to abandonment and can be considered for abandonment in whole or in part. And what does in part mean? In part means that a water right can be abandoned as to a volume, a rate, a use, and possibly in certain circumstances, in an alternate point of diversion. In essence, it's any aspect of that water right that hasn't been put to use can be subject to abandonment. So non-use, however, does not constitute abandonment just in and of itself. There has to be an intent to abandon that water right. But I think coupled with that, there also needs to be an intent to beneficially use that water right. You just can't solely hang your hat on the fact that there's some intent an intent not to abandon. There needs to be that intent to beneficially use as well. So an example of a situation where an owner of a water right did not intend to abandon their right is by becoming more efficient. So for example, where I'm from, Division 6, we have a tremendous amount of flood irrigation. And so say there's a water right owner that wants to go from flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation. The result of doing that is going to be a tremendous reduction in the amount of water they divert. So their intent was not to have the water right abandoned. Their intent was to become more efficient. As a result, the statutes do allow the state division engineers to consider special circumstances that would negate that intent to abandon the water right, such as in this case, becoming more efficient. However, as this document describes, it would be considered, though, after an extended period of time, that that's a permanent way that they're going to irrigate. So they might be able to get past the first couple of abandonment processes, but after so many years, after they've been sprinkler irrigating, we could consider that a permanent change, and the water right, in part, be considered for abandonment. Then looking at conditional water rights, again, obviously a conditional water right can be subject to abandonment. To avoid abandonment, obviously they have to put that water right to the conditional water right to beneficial use, so they have to show diligence. And they do this every 6 years. So you can kind of think of it as a sense of, with conditional water rights, that they go through an abandonment process every 6 years. They have to show again whether it's been put to beneficial use or whether they've been diligent. Obviously, coupled with diligence is the need to show that the water right has not become speculative and that they can and will complete the appropriation. So I think you can easily see how a conditional water right can also be followed when it comes to the term use or lose it. I think with that, Kevin's going to talk about the other, 3 topics, and then 2, and then I'll follow up after that.
Thanks, Aaron. So two of the areas of concern that I mentioned before, one was changing a water right, and the other applying intentional conservation to a water right or applying water to a decreed use. We're going to touch on those right now. Starting with changing a water right, and we've had more than our share of discussion on this topic this morning, but here's just one other aspect of that, and that is this area of concern really has to do with a few, obviously an HCU analysis, consumptive use analysis that will be done and look at times of non-use and how that affects it. Well, we talked about that already, but where this use it or lose it question has really come in so much, that advice, that wisdom that sometimes attorneys or others give to water users, you need to divert as much as you can, whether you need it or not, to retain the value of your water right, because there's going to be a consumptive use analysis someday if you want to change the water right, and the degraded diversions will support a degraded quantification. And that sure seems intuitive, but there are two problems with that when we talk about diverting more than is needed for beneficial use. And first, of course, it's just a question of waste, and the statutes direct us on waste and how wasteful diversions need to be curtailed. So for that water, for that amount of water that's diverted beyond the duty water, and certainly we understand that duty water goes beyond just the consumptive use because we need to get water to the use, and there's going to be return flows. But for that amount of diversion that goes above that, that's going to be waste. So that's, of course, detrimental to the river, detrimental to the administrative system, and it's just not allowed. So, we would want to curtail that waste. The second thing, though, and importantly to the process, that diversion is realistically not helpful to the determination of historic consumptive use. And the reason is, when we look at that consumptive use analysis, and we have the experts up here that went into detail, but really, in the end, we're looking at diversions, and diversions need to be adjusted by an efficiency factor. It really needs to go toward what that was diverted to the crop. But then we're also going to look at the crop and what its irrigation requirement was. And so we have those two those two alternate perspectives on the consumptive use. And we're going to have to look at the lower one, because we could have diverted massive amounts of water, but if that 40-acre crop can only consume so much through its irrigation requirement, that is what's going to prevail in that consumptive use analysis. So that means that by diverting that large amount of water, if that use of that diversion is not supported by a record of crops being grown on that parcel, then you really have not helped your consumptive use analysis at all, and along the way you did, again, commit this wasteful practice. It's not good for the river and other administrative systems. So maybe a simpler, more straightforward way of saying that, no matter how much you divert, you can't get consumptive use for more than you consumptively used. That's a good, helpful way to look at it. So again, going back to put that in context, what I started out talking about here was that advice given to water users, whether you need it or not, divert as much as you possibly can. That supports your record of beneficial use. But it really doesn't. It really doesn't. So that's the quick look at consumptive use, the consumptive use analysis aspect of use it or lose it. And again, you see that in your document, and we're going into great detail in that larger document that I talked about. Another item that's been of particular interest, and some of the environmental folks that participated on this group of stakeholders, they were very interested in this, and that is just that idea of applying intentional conservation to a water right or applying it to an undetreated use, and talking about the intentional conservation or sustainability interests in our water right and how that affects it in the future. We've got some good guidance, legislative guidance in a couple areas. I mentioned Senate Bill 19 from a couple years ago. That's a good place to start. In divisions 4, 5, and 6, there's not going to be a reduction in your consumptive use analysis for water that was not diverted. So again, back to user losing. If it was not diverted because it was participating in some sort of formal program, then the law excuses that from being used to reduce the consumptive use. So there's another case that just because you didn't use it It doesn't mean that you will lose it. And Senate Bill 75 did a similar thing for final permits in the designated basins, that there to be informal conservation practices, and by virtue of taking those actions, your final permit would be used. So those are two legislative solutions. Now, when it comes to administrative approvals, we've got some explicit guidance in the statutes for in-stream flow loans that there would be no historic consumptive use reduction due to participation in something that was not a decreed use, the in-stream flow loan. So that's explicitly protected by statute, and the same is true for rotational crop management contracts. But there's also implicit protection, at least on things like abandonment and historic consumptive use analyses for fallowing leasing pilot projects, and of course substitute water supply plans. And that probably gets back to that representative study period again. Can you excuse those years when it wasn't being put to its decreed beneficial use because it had an administrative approval for some other alternate use? So I think that follows in the spirit of what the intent of those statutes and that approach is. And getting back to abandonment on these intentional conservation efforts or administrative approvals, there's certainly room in the statute, and touched on it before, where if there was no intent to abandon, and certainly my decision to, for a small period of time, leave my water right in the river to help in-stream flows, that can get above that intent to abandon fairly easily just by stating that, by documenting that was the intent. But again, in all of these, for example, leaving water in the river or going to a more efficient practice, as Aaron warned us, ultimately, after a period of years, decades, that is going to be seen as your practice. And so if your new practice is always going to be leaving that water in the river, or always sprinkler irrigating instead of flood irrigating, then that is going to be subject to consideration of an intent to abandon when you consider for this. That's going to be a consideration. So I'm going to leave it at that. And Aaron, if you could just talk a little bit about this document that hopefully most of you have in front of you now, and how we use that, and then we'll open it up to questions on this process and so on.